So we've been looking at real and nominal GDP. And so once more, let's define GDP as the total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a year. We've looked at real GDP, which is in base year prices, so that we can compare one year to the next, and we can see how much more we are producing as opposed to just seeing a price change. Nominal GDP was that total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a year, but it was in the current market prices. And so if we simply looked at a change in nominal GDP from one year to the next, we couldn't tell whether that was because of a change in price or because we were making more stuff. And that's what we looked at the previous level. In this level, we want to look at that GDP in terms of what we are making, and we want to look at how do you increase that GDP. We're going to look at another term besides nominal and real GDP, and that is potential GDP. So potential GDP is the total value of all the goods and services produced in an economy in a year if you used all of your resources. So potential GDP is how big the economy could be. If we used all of our labor, if we use all of our land, we use all of our capital, this is how big our economy could be. Now, we can represent potential GDP in dollar form, just like we did real and nominal GDP. And we're going to do that in later levels. But right now, as we look at potential GDP, let's look at it in terms of the goods that we produce. So here on this graph, this is a graph called a production possibility frontier. It shows the combination of two goods or services that we could produce. So for example, as a society, we could make only capital goods, or we could make only consumer goods, or some combination of the two. Okay, it could be anywhere along this curve. Now, how much we actually produce might be somewhere in here. The production possibility frontier is showing our potential, what we could do. Okay? And later in other levels, we're going to look at what happens when what you actually produce doesn't match that potential. That's a gap. And what kind of gap do we have, and how do we fix that? That's where we're going eventually. There's some kind of gap between where we are and where we could be, and we can look at how we can fix the economy to get there. So right now, as we focus on potential GDP, it's the combination of these goods that uses all of our resources. So if we're not using all of our resources, we're going to be somewhere underneath that curve. Well, today's topic and this week's level is about economic growth. That is, how do you get that production possibility frontier and this potential GDP to shift outward? How do we get more of all kinds of goods and services? That's sustainable economic growth. But before we get there, let's ask ourselves a question about this production possibility frontier. Let's suppose that you run your own country. Okay? You're the dictator of your own command economy, and you have a choice. What combination of goods is your country going to produce? So in option A, you produce mostly capital goods and only a bit of consumer goods. Option B, you produce mostly consumer goods and only a little of capital goods. Well, let's think back. What did it mean to be a capital good? A capital good was a good that is produced and then used to make something else. So if your country makes predominantly capital goods, then that means that you're going to have an ability to have more goods in the future. right? Because you're making the tools now so that we can make things with those tools next year. But the problem is that you're focusing on capital goods, which means the amount of consumer goods, the things you can enjoy now, are not readily available. So in option A, your people are going to starve this year. They're making all the tools to make things next year, but that means they have nothing now. Well, what about option B? Option B says we're going to make lots of consumer goods, which means your people get lots of goods now. But in the future, as your population grows, and when you need more things in the future, because you didn't invest in capital goods, you have no machines or tools, you won't be able to make those other items in the future. So with option B, your people starve next year. And while this might be a simplification, each country and the economies within it, whether that's at the provincial level or at the federal level, nationwide, have to make decisions about which industries to encourage, which ones to support, which ones to protect. And so they have to keep in mind this trade-off in terms of making more capital goods and making more consumer goods and encouraging that right combination that allows for people to thrive now and for that economic growth and thriving in the future. Well, we want to know about economic growth. We want to know, how do we get out here? How do we get that potential GDP to increase so that we have more in the future? Well, let's look at that. There are really 4 factors that contribute to economic growth. These are the 4 things that increase our potential GDP. That is, they change the size the economy could be if we used all of our resources. So we're talking about sustainable economic growth, because short-term economic growth is when you're getting your actual to meet your potential, right? You're not using all of your labor, so if you can start using your labor, your actual gets to your potential, the economy grows. We want to talk about a sustainable economic growth, that is getting the potential to increase, so that we are making more goods and services even when we're using all of our resources. Well, there are 4 ways to do that. 1 is you increase your natural resources. So Canada already has lots of natural resources. So we're not seeing tons of economic growth come from there because we already have natural resources. When countries see economic growth from increasing their natural resources, typically they're taking over other countries to get more resources. So if you think about the colonization of Africa back in 1880, the reason that you had England and France and Belgium and these countries move in to Africa and colonize this area is because they were looking for more natural resources so they could get economic growth. Today we look at Russia and Russia's expansions into Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. All of this is to get access to more of their resources to help create economic growth for their country. The second way you can create economic growth is to increase your real capital. So we could increase our spending on machines and tools and technology. So if we can get more businesses buying machines, mechanizing things, then we're going to produce more goods and services. The third option is to see an increase in technology. So when companies do research and development and come up with new ways to make things, then we become more efficient. And that means that we're producing more goods and services per person, per worker. And so the total amount of goods and services we're able to produce using all of our workers and machines increases. So an increase in technology will also create economic growth. The fourth way to increase potential GDP and get that sustainable economic growth is to increase the quantity and quality of your labor. Now, which one of these four do you think is the dominant source of Canadian economic growth? Which one does most of our economic growth come from? Well, the answer is the quantity and quality of labor. So we'll look in more detail about how you increase the quantity and quality of labor, since this is the primary source of Canadian economic growth.